Hello, everyone. It's my honor to be speaking with you today at the Symposium on Global Order Transformation and Development Paradigm Innovation from the perspective of African civilizational diversity, and to be speaking as a part of Development Watch Center. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge some of our distinguished guests, such as the Right Honorable Amama Mbabazi, former Prime Minister of Uganda, the Honorable Okello Oryem, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uganda, Professor Jia Wenjian, the president of the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Ambassador Zhang Lijong, China's ambassador to Uganda. In addition, I'd like to welcome and acknowledge the many other valued and important guests among whom I'm privileged to be speaking today. Now, the argument I want to make is deceptively simple. Africa is not a passive recipient of China's rise. It is instead a sovereign enabler. And this changes everything about what we think we know about global power. Today, I want to explore how African states actively co-produce China's legitimacy, diplomatically, economically, ideologically, and militarily. We'll reflect briefly on what it means to be a sovereign enabler and why African states are fundamental both to China's rise, but also fundamental to the creation of a fairer and more equal world and a post-Western order. First, African states are not passive or dependent. They're not merely sites where power is projected or resources are extracted from. Instead, they're sovereign agents, making deliberate and very strategic choices about how to engage, align, and assert themselves on the global stage. Second, China's global legitimacy is not self-contained. It's not something that emerges straight from or solely from their economic power, their military strength, or even the domestic political model. It is, in part, co-authored, enabled, among other things, by African states through diplomatic partnerships, development cooperation, and discursive alignment. African recognition matters, and China knows it. Third, this partnership is not just transactional, it's a productive partnership. It produces something new. It helps to construct something very important, a post-Western global order, one that isn't rooted in hierarchy, conditionality, or the paternalism of the donor-recipient model, but instead in mutual recognition and sovereign affirmation. This paper, then, is not just about China's role in Africa. It's about how legitimacy is made and who gets to make it. And in this account, African states are not geopolitical background characters. They are instead sovereign enablers, actors who make choices that shape the legitimacy, the reach, and even the meaning of China's rise. By foregrounding this agency, African agency, we're going to challenge two persistent misconceptions. The first is that Africa is simply reacting to China's outreach, rather than shaping the terms of its engagement. And the second, that China's engagement in Africa is purely instrumental or non-ideological, a view that's repeated in the work of many scholars like Taylor, Large, and Brodingham, but one that underestimates the normative dimensions of this relationship. So what I'm going to aim to show you today is that the China-Africa relationship is a co-productive one. It's a relationship where both sides, through repeated acts of recognition, negotiation, and alignment, are engaged in building something much larger, a reimagined global order, one in which legitimacy does not have to flow from Washington, Brussels, or Geneva, but instead can flow from Addis Ababa, from Luanda, from Dakar, from Kampala, from places that have too often been treated as peripheral, but are in fact central to the future of global power. So let's ground this conversation theoretically. Here, sovereignty is not a trophy that a state owns. Following the theory of Wendt and Zarakol, how they argue, sovereignty is relational. It must be continually performed and recognized by others. So constructivist international relations theory, which is the tradition these authors come from, reminds us that it's not just material capabilities that matter. Norms, shared understandings, and shared identity claims help to frame what sovereignty is. So from this view, China's rise does not just depend on its economy. It depends on how other people and other countries, especially in the global south, recognize and affirm this rise. And that is where Africa comes in, not as a subordinate region, but as the co-author of China's sovereign identity. African states legitimize China through diplomatic alignment, development partnerships, and shared discourse. This is no dependency. Instead, it's what Amitabh Acharya calls a post-Western logic of power, a system based not on dominance, but on mutual recognition. And this is deeply anchored in African intellectual traditions, traditions that a number of our speakers have spoken about or will speak about today. Mbembe, for example, speaks of sovereignty as authored instead of inherited. And Getachew reminds us that African states didn't just want independence, they wanted to rebuild the world. And that is what this partnership represents. Not just reaction, but world making. Much of the literature on China-African relations has looked at what China gains materially, things like oil, minerals, access to new markets, and even strategic logistics hubs. Now, of course, these are important, but they only tell us a part of the story. What's missing here is a deeper recognition of African agency. Too often, African states are portrayed as either reactive or ideologically neutral, simply accommodating China's rise and going along for the ride. But this paper reframes the question. What does China gain from African states as sovereign enablers? Beyond material cooperation, China gains things like symbolic legitimacy, normative endorsement, and diplomatic support. And all of this helps it claim a post-Western identity on the global stage. Now that's a different kind of power, and it's certainly a type of power that Africa helps construct. Here's a summary table showing you how I flipped the argument around. So we have the dominant view on the left where Africa is a recipient, and in this research I'm describing Africa as the author of legitimacy. We have the dominant view of China as a non-ideological power, whereas we're describing China in this paper as discursively enabled, promoting a post-Western order. We have the dominant view that sovereignty is all about material things and that partnerships are all about material things. And we have our intervention that sovereignty and partnerships are about symbolic and political co-construction. So let's look first at diplomacy and norm making. So African states are simply not voting with China out of economic loyalty or political convenience. Instead, what we see is that their diplomatic behavior reflects a deep normative alignment. They're consistently backing China in forums like the United Nations, BRICS, or FOCAC. They're consistently reaffirming the One China policy, aligning in the G77, and supporting UN Security Council reform. Actions that symbolically and practically reinforce China's position as a legitimate global power. But more importantly, they reject Western-led resolutions that frame interventionism or conditionality as universal norms. This isn't just strategic, it's ideological. This is a performance of sovereignty, where Africa helps narrate a new diplomatic grammar. This is more about things other than solidarity. So as Zarakol reminds us, legitimacy is co-produced. When African states echo China's vision of a multipolar world, they aren't just supporting China. They're helping write the script of a post-Western global order. China's global rise has material roots, and many of those roots run through Africa. So it's true that African states supply the raw materials, things like oil from Angola, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and port access across the continent. All of this feeds China's industrial machine. But this is not just about resources, it's about infrastructure alignment. Africa's openness to Chinese projects under the Belt and Road Initiative enables China to bypass Western-controlled trade systems and project its developmental model globally. All of this matters. The Belt and Road Initiative, railways, ports, and pipelines all across Africa are not just economic tools. These are sovereignty tools, ways for China to assert economic autonomy. And importantly, this is not one-sided. African states are choosing China as a partner, not just for funding, but because China offers a model that doesn't come wrapped up in conditionalities. So we have to understand here that Africa's role is not passive, it's not peripheral, it's strategic. It enables China's economic sovereignty beyond the reach of Western systems. Security is often where partnerships unravel, but not in this case, because African states have invited China to play a role in peacekeeping, counterterrorism, and even military logistics. Djibouti, for example, hosts China's first overseas base, but crucially, it hosts it on African terms. There is no regime change, there are no military conditionalities, there are no coercive alliances. China's actions are framed through non-interference, and that posture only holds because African states enable it. China gets access, but more than that, it gets legitimacy. When African governments accept China's support, they perform an act of recognition. You are not a threat, you are a partner. This is not NATO-style hegemony, this is security by invitation, and it reflects the mutual affirmation of sovereignty. At the highest level, then, sovereignty is not just a matter of borders or policies. It's a question of how the state is perceived by others, by global institutions, and by history. This is where Africa's role becomes most profound. African states do not just supply resources, votes, or infrastructure, they supply something much rarer, symbolic validation. They present China as a leader in the global south, not because China demands it, but because Africa affirms it. Mbembe put it best when he said, "Sovereignty is not given, it's authored." And in this case, African states are among the co-authors of China's global narrative. Meanwhile, China amplifies African voices on the global stages, affirming that African states are not just subjects of geopolitics, but shapers of it. This is not dependency, this is a discursive partnership, and it helps us reimagine what global legitimacy might look like outside of Western framing. Let me end where we began, but with a sharper focus. African states are not just participants in global affairs, they're strategic agents, sovereign enablers, and co-authors of the international order. To describe them as clients, dependents, or passively recipients is not just analytically lazy, it's politically disabling. The China-Africa relationship is not merely a resource for infrastructure exchange, it's something far more consequential. It's a sovereignty-enabling partnership. It affirms Africa's global voice and helps China consolidate its legitimacy as a global power outside of the Western-dominated system. In this sense, China can't be China globally without Africa. Not because of the commodities, but because of recognition. Because of the symbolic, diplomatic, and normative capital that African states provide in multilateral fora, in development discourse, and in the architecture of alternative institutions. To rethink this dynamic is to do three things. To move beyond Western-centric assumptions about how power circulates and where legitimacy comes from. To reclaim African agency, not just within the continent, but in the shaping of the world order. And to challenge the idea that global legitimacy is only forged in Western capitals. Africa is not waiting to be invited into the future. It's already building it, in partnership with others who reject hierarchy, conditionality, and control. This is not a story of dependence. This is a story of co-creation, and that story is only just beginning.